So now that our users can add a location to their diary entries, it makes sense that we allow them to view their diary entries on a map and even click on one of the map markers in order to view the associated diary entry. So that's what we're going to build in this lesson. So very excitingly, the first thing that we're going to do is create an entirely new tab view. So this is going to be the view that's going to hold our map. And because the map is just going to take up the entire height of the user's screen, we're going to make it not scrollable. And then right away, let's set this up as a tab. So we're going to include it as a tab item. That's going to then add one new tab to our tab bar. And I actually want this to be in the middle here. And we can set it right away to our tab style that we created earlier in the course. So it's going to match the styling of our other tabs. Let's update the label. Let's update the icon as well. So we're actually going to go into our phosphor library, which we've been using throughout the course. And we could use any of these icons. I think this one is the most appropriate. And then just like for our other tab items, we've got a condition which says that when the tab item is selected, we're going to use a filled version of the icon. So I'm going to do the same thing here for our map icon, where I'm going to change the icon to a filled version of that map icon, like so. And then right away, you can see that we can go to our new map view. Brilliant. So let's add our map now. So the map is actually a visual element that we can add to the page. And the first thing that I'm going to do is change the layout settings. We've got a fixed height for this map. I'm going to turn that off so that it extends the full height of the viewport. Now, if we go and test this out right away and try and load our map, you'll notice that we get an error popping up here saying that we're missing our Google Maps key. And this key is something that we need in order to have this map element function properly. This is actually a Google Maps element here. And as such, we need to have a key, an API key specifically, in order to access this element and have it work properly. Now, there's an article in Bubble's documentation about how to set these keys up, which I'll link to in the description for this video. And when you've got your key, you want to come under Settings, General, and if you scroll down, there is a section here that lets you add your API key, both for iOS here and for Android. Now, what I've got here are keys where I haven't added any API restrictions within my Google Cloud Console. And this is fine for right now while we're just developing our application, but we will want to make sure that we're adding the appropriate restrictions to our API keys before our application is in production and in the hands of real users. And that means that in theory, anybody who gets access to my API key can use Google's services on my behalf. So Google will think that any requests like displaying a map or searching for a location will come from my Google Cloud account and will be billed to my account. That obviously isn't something that you want to do because it could mean some bad actor racking up a large bill to your account. So we will want to add a proper restriction to these keys eventually. For now though, while we are developing, it's perfectly fine for us to just use an unrestricted key as long as we don't share it with anybody. Now we actually have the choice of not using a Google Map element if our users are using an iOS device. So we actually have this option here to use Apple Maps on iOS. And if you tick that, we don't actually need to have a Google Maps API key for iOS. And what that will mean is that the map element will be provided by Apple Maps, not by Google Maps. Now they do function largely the same. I will toggle this off though, so we're going to use the Google Maps version so that we can all see how the Google Maps version is going to work regardless of what device that we're testing on. Now you've got some other settings that you can use here to modify the appearance of the map, like the zoom level. You can even disable the ability for users to be able to drag the map. So that will mean that the map is just fixed in place. The user can't actually move it with their finger. I'm going to toggle that back on because we do want that functionality. And then the most important part really is this section up here. So we've got a choice here about what markers, this little guy here, that we want to display on the map. So we could choose just a single marker. So I could literally just type in here, do a search for a particular diary entry that I've created. And let's say we just want to find any that are created by the current user and that have a location field that is not empty. And we'll grab the first item from that list. And then we actually need to provide here a geographic address type of data. So we've saved that in the location field for our diary entry. And so if I load this up, you see that we've got this one marker appearing seemingly in the center of London. And that seems to correspond to this diary entry here. You can, by the way, just while you're testing this out, add in some other locations here. You can add these manually to your diary entries so that you can view different locations on the map. Just note that unless you have set up your geocode API key, you'll only be able to add a certain amount of these addresses in a limited amount of time. And that's because if you leave this blank, you're actually using Bubble's own API key with Google that they're providing to all test apps. So they only let you make a certain amount of requests to format an address in a limited amount of time. So, and what I mean by format is when I type something here that's not quite a complete location, see how it just automatically there got formatted correctly. So that's what Google is doing for us, which then allows these locations to be a valid geographic address type of data that can consequently be displayed out here on a map. Now, obviously showing a single marker isn't that useful. So what we could set this to is instead be a list of markers. And what we would do here is we would choose where are these markers coming from. And in our case, they're going to come from a list of diary entries. Then in the data source, we just choose which diary entries do we want to display. I think our search constraint is actually fine. We're just currently showing the first item's location. So let's get rid of that. So we are left with a search for diary entries. And then we just have to tell this map element which of the fields on our diary entry holds that geographic address data. And that is, of course, the location field. Now, if you're following along and you test this out, you may see something like this. Basically, well, the map here has just ended up in the middle of the ocean. So because the mobile editor is still in beta, this map element still has a few rough edges. What I found can help is that if you set the center and zoom manually, just center the map on one of the entries from your data source. So if I copy this expression, and let's say if we're sorting these by their date so that the most recent are at the top, then let's just grab the first one. So we're going to view here the most recent diary entry, and then we'll have to choose here the location value. And then if we set the initial zoom to something relatively low, like 4, then we can make sure that our markers are appearing all properly. Now you can also customize the appearance of the map marker. So if you want to learn how to do that, I encourage you to click on this C reference that appears when you hover over this drop down, and that'll take you to the corresponding article in the Bubble manual. We're just going to keep it simple and use these default markers. And then the last thing for us to do here is just allow a user to click on a marker and that open the corresponding diary entry. So we can actually do that using a specific workflow action that only becomes available once we have a map element on the page, and that is a maps marker is clicked. And so what we can do here is we can actually open up that diary entry details view. So I can here go to a view, and I will open it in a stack, and it's going to be, of course, the diary entry details. And then we can, like always, pass in a property to this view, the diary entry details view. And we can actually grab the diary entry from the map marker that was selected. So if we go this map's current marker, that is the marker that was just tapped on, the result of this current marker, as you can see, evaluates to a diary entry. And so in this way, we can click on one of our diary entries and see it appear. And then of course, if we go back, then we're now back on the map page. Brilliant. Now, one small user experience tweak that we may want to make here is that when a user opens a diary entry from the map, we maybe just want to show the parent trip here, because right now we're viewing diary entries sort of out of context, right? It makes sense that if we're entering a diary entry from here, that we should be able to go to the corresponding trip from this diary entry. And so to set this up, I'm on my diary entry details view. I'm going to add a text element here up the top, and this is going to display the trip title for the associated diary entry. And the diary entry we can get from this view property, which we set up earlier in the course. So I should just be able to, if I access that view property of this diary entry details view, so I'll grab the diary entry, I can pull out here the trip associated with this diary entry, and of course then also the title value for that trip, which is what I want to display here. And just so we can see something in the canvas, I might say something like this. And I want to modify the styling here so this actually looks like a clickable element. And one of the ways I can do that is by bumping up the font weight to give it a degree of boldness like this. And even more importantly, I want to give it some kind of underline, which really signals that, hey, this is clickable. The only problem is when you actually view this, that underline to me doesn't look that good. It's just way too close to the characters of that text. So I'm going to do this in a slightly different way. I'm going to just remove this minimum height for now. So this text element is just fitting its height right around the actual text inside, the text content inside. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to add just a border to the bottom of this element, which is effectively going to act like an underline. But I'm going to have a little bit more control over the appearance if I do it as a border. So I'm going to click here to define each border independently. And that then is going to let me set just a bottom border. And I can set this to the same color as my text. And you can see that immediately that looks a lot better. My only concern is that this text element is only 23 pixels high. Ideally, I want it to be a little bit taller so that there's more space for the user to click on. So what I would probably do here is I would right click and actually just put this inside of another container. It doesn't really matter if it's a column or a row, and this can be the group parent trip. And this group itself is what I actually want the user to click on. So I'm going to set this to have a height that I'm happy is big enough for the user to click on, so 44 pixels. Let's also fit the width to the content inside, so to this text element. And then the text element can simply float in the middle of the parent container here. So then all we have to do is add a workflow on this parent container to take us back to the diary entries trip. So I'm going to add a workflow when this group is clicked, which is going to go to view, and it's going to open in a stack. That's what we want, so that if we want, the user can go back from the trip view back to this diary entry view. And the target view is of course going to be trip details. And then what trip are we passing? Well, again, it's the trip that's associated with this diary entry, right? And that diary entry lives inside of this view property called diary entry. And so of course, let's just grab the trip value. And so now if I click on one of my map markers, I see this, and I can click here where it says Cardiff City Break to go to the parent trip. And from here, right, I can just open up the same diary entry or other diary entries, add them onto the stack, and then go back through my views all the way back to the map. Now, one thing that you might want to do if you're following along is, if I go from here, a diary entry into a trip, and then from that trip, I go into another diary entry, and then again into the trip. Well, I've got sort of a strange stack now. I'm on a trip, I go back into a diary entry from that trip, I go back onto the trip, I go back onto a diary entry for that trip, and then I go back to the map view. That may be fine for you, but we could also make it so that if you enter a diary entry from the context of a trip, like let's say click here on spontaneous dinner, then hitting this button here, Italy backpacking, should, instead of adding a view to the stack, it should instead, if this is clicked, go back to the parent trip. And we can control that using a view property. So I could just add here a new property, which is opened from map, and set this to be a yes or a no value, which we don't want to be optional. We're always going to set this from somewhere. And then what we can do is from our map view, we set this to be yes, because we're opening this diary entry view obviously from the map view, and from our trip details view, when one of our vertical list items here is clicked, that's the other place where we're showing this diary entry details. We want to set this to be no. And then within this diary entry details view, we can add some conditional logic to this group. Or we could say that, yeah, let's open up the trip details, but only if the user has navigated to this view from the map. So where opened from map is yes, right? Otherwise, let's just go to the previous mobile view. So I could add this condition in the inverse. So only when that diary entry details opened from map value is no. And this then means that if I open up here a diary entry from the map, and then I enter the associated trip, then that opened a new view on the stack. But if I now open up a diary entry from this trip and click on the associated trip, I should go back to the previous view, and I do, rather than adding an additional view on top. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this section on accessing our device's resources. And hopefully you got a little bit of intuition now for how this works, so that as Bubble adds support for more native device resources, you can build features around them in your app. Now, in the next section, things are getting serious. We're going to learn how we secure our users' data, how we schedule workflows to happen at some point in the future. And most excitingly, how we connect our app to external services like OpenAI. So I'll see you in the next section.